The following history may shock you, but we believe it is important to tell the history honestly, and to make conclusions from it, and to reassess values for the future generations. A great man once said, "A nation that does not know its past has no future." We should not forget the horrors of the past, just so they never happen again. The Nazi regime campaigned against and persecuted sexual minorities between 1933 and 1945. It is important to note right away, for example, that not all men arrested and convicted under paragraph 175 were identified as gays. However, any man who had a sexual relationship with another man, or was suspected of doing so, faced arrest in Nazi Germany, regardless of how he understood his sexuality. Paragraph 175 was a statute of the German Penal Code that prohibited sexual relations between men. During the Nazi period, police arrested about 100,000 people for allegedly violating this law. About 50,000 were imprisoned. Identifying as a non-traditional male was never explicitly criminalized in Germany. But the Nazi campaign against gays and the regime's zealous enforcement of paragraph 175 made their lives in Germany dangerous and unbearable, especially since 1936. The first high-profile assassination on grounds of sexual orientation was that of Ernst Röhm and other leaders of the ST, storm troops, from June to July 1934. These murders changed the way Nazi propaganda talked about sexual minorities. Röhm and other ST leaders were murdered on Hitler's orders as part of a power struggle at the highest levels of the German government. But after the purge, Nazi propaganda used Röhm's sexuality to justify these murders. In doing so, they played on the prejudices of the German population against same-sex sexuality. And in 1936, SS leader and German police chief Heinrich Himmler established the Reich Central Office for Anti-Gay and Abortion. This office was part of the Kripo, criminal police, and worked closely with the Gestapo. In the late 1930s, the police raided bars and other meeting places that they believed were popular among gay men. The police set up cordons around bars and other places and questioned anyone who seemed suspicious. Those whom the police found guilty were prosecuted for violating paragraph 175, or, in some cases, sent straight to a concentration camp. The police raids were public and high-profile manifestations of the Nazi campaign against sexual minorities. Since the early 1940s, between 5,000 and 15,000 men have been imprisoned in concentration camps as homosexuals or sex offenders. This group of prisoners was usually required to wear a pink triangle on their camp uniforms as part of the prisoner classification system. Many, but not all, of the prisoners in this pink triangle identified themselves as gay. According to many survivors, pink triangle prisoners were one of the groups most abused in the camps. Sometimes pink triangle prisoners were assigned the most grueling and demanding jobs in the camp labor system. They were often physically and sexually abused by camp guards and fellow inmates. In some cases, they were beaten and publicly humiliated. In the concentration camp at Buchenwald, inhumane medical experiments were carried out on prisoners in the pink triangle. Starting in November 1942, concentration camp commandants officially had the right to order forced castration of pink triangle prisoners. Prisoners with the pink triangle remained isolated and powerless in the hierarchy of prisoners. In the spring of 1945, Allied soldiers liberated concentration camps and freed prisoners, including those wearing the pink triangle. But the end of the war and the defeat of the Nazi regime did not necessarily bring a sense of liberation to gays. They remained marginalized in German society. In particular, sexual relations between men remained illegal in Germany for much of the 20th century. This meant that many men serving sentences for allegedly violating paragraph 175 remained in prison after the war. Tens of thousands more were convicted in the post-war period. It was easier to deal with women of non-traditional orientation during Nazi rule in Germany. Under Hitler's regime, there was no official law or policy prohibiting sexual relations between women. During the Weimar era, 1918 to 1933, Germans publicly challenged gender and sexual norms. This was especially true in large cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Frankfurt am Main. Around the same time, individual lesbian communities, social clubs, and associations emerged to develop networks and connections. The best-known lesbian associations were the women's clubs Violetta and Monbijou in Berlin. These associations held informal meetings in bars and nightclubs, such as the Monaco DLA Dance Club, and also gathered at the famous El Dorado nightclub. The Nazi regime viewed lesbians primarily as women. They believed that German women had a special task: motherhood. According to Nazi logic, lesbians were women and therefore should be mothers. They were obligated to give birth to racially pure Germans, called Aryans. Many programs and laws were passed to encourage Aryan reproduction. One example is the Lebensborn program. It encouraged German women to have many children, even outside of marriage. At the same time, the regime tried to prohibit or limit the reproduction of other supposedly inferior groups. In July 1933, a new law mandated the sterilization of people with supposedly hereditary disabilities. Other laws, such as the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, defined who could have sex with whom. For 3 months, I disguised myself as a man, and very successfully. I passed my mother several times. She never recognized me. So said Frida Belinfante, a half-Jewish lesbian. She used this disguise to hide from the Nazi authorities. In a later interview, she said, "I really looked good." Her involvement in the resistance movement included planning the destruction of Amsterdam's population registry in March 1943, falsifying identity cards, and organizing hiding places for those wanted by the Nazis. She was forced into hiding after many other members of the Netherlands-based gay resistance group were executed in 1943 by the occupation authorities. In December 1943, Frida fled to Switzerland and then emigrated to the United States. Also worth remembering here is the case of Ellie Smula and Margaret Rosenberg. In 1940, the Gestapo detained and interrogated Smula and Rosenberg. The Gestapo did this based on denunciations from the women's co-workers. Colleagues alleged that the two women had engaged in sexual relations with other women. The Gestapo claimed that these sexual relationships interfered with the women's job duties at the Berlin streetcar stop. Smula and Rosenberg were accused of subversion. They were then deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. There, the two women were registered as political prisoners. In their camp records, the notation "lesbian" was written down. In the camps, women who identified themselves or were identified as lesbians did not wear a pink triangle. Instead, they wore badges corresponding to the official reason for their arrest. Some women engaged in sexual relations with their fellow inmates. Not all of these women who engaged in same-sex relationships were lesbians. Some women described them as a source of comfort in the camps and considered them necessary for survival. Finding historical sources related to the experiences of lesbians under the Nazi regime remains a research challenge. The difficulty is that very few lesbians have shared their accounts of their experiences at the time. This is partly due to the fact that the topic of sexual relations between women remained a taboo for decades after the victory over the Nazis.